We were speaking of the individual ego as a basic factor for producing wrong action and evil. We also saw that though the ego is a development by nature for a particular purpose of focusing the flow of life in individual centers, ultimately it is a pragmatic fiction because its only purpose is till the true being within emerges. Till then, nature uses the ego. Ego's first movement is towards division, self-concentration, self-affirmation, and treating everything else as different. So division. But still, nature continues to urge it from within. Ego should move forward. It should not stick to its individual status. Now this push of nature on the ego to enlarge itself, to embrace more and more of the world, is wrongly translated by the ego in trying to possess others. Instead of itself enlarging, it tries to swallow others, to possess others, to attack others, and make them part of itself, its empire, its interests. So this is a wholly misconstrued translation of the original impulse of nature. But still, nature accepts these moments as circumstances of evolution, the good as well as evil, indifferently. But in course of time, nature burdens man, the human mind, with the sense of good and evil in order to push him further. And the method by which man responds to this impulse of nature is a kind of selection of things which he considers to be good, rejection of things which he considers to be bad, evil. And he gets support for this operation from standards of morality, ethics, religion. But all these, we have seen, skim the surface. What is considered to be good in one age or in one society is condemned as evil in another. So these are very relative values, and they do not go to the root of the causes. The most that can be done and is done by observing these standards of morality, ethics, is a certain imperfect control. But the mixture remains, something of good, something of evil. It continues, and we take it as a part of life. A little further, when the purely ethical motive prevails, man learns to select and retain what is good and reject evil, and shape his life in terms of an ideal, not just observing the rules and regulations, but he has an ideal, and in his effort to realize the ideal, by developing himself in the mold of the ideal, he retains certain features, rejects the others. But even these ideals are mental ideals and they are limited. We see again that ideals are not the same everywhere. The true ideal, the true call is the infinite and the supreme. Not just being good, not just being kind, not just avoiding evil, but to grow in the image of the infinite and the supreme. And what happens? That if the ideal by which we choose to govern our life is narrow, then the force of life, general life force, it pushes so hard that it is difficult to maintain adherence to our ideal. The ideal is upset and on occasions is broken. If that does not happen, then there is a push away from life. We say that life is ultimately evil. You cannot separate the evil elements from life. So the best course is to escape from life, to withdraw from life, give up life, that it will always be there. The tail of a dog, however much you may straighten it, again it goes back into its shape, and so on. So the force of life does not allow us to stay in a limited condition, either by following a religious ideal or any mental ideal. It either breaks that ideal or pushes us away from life. It is only in the ancient Indian spiritual thought and practice that it was recognized that the practice of good, practice of truth is only a necessary preparation. There is something else, and this preparation helps to realize something, a state of consciousness, a state of being which is beyond sin and virtue. So we practice virtue, we avoid sin to purify ourselves, to equip ourselves to reach a state which is beyond sin and virtue. And all the relative good that we practice, that we seek after, is only a training for an absolute good. Absolute good means the ultimate good, and that good is good under all conditions, everywhere, at all times. So that's the aim, that's the ultimate. And true knowledge of good and evil, no, not that. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as we know it in the life, is rooted in inconscience, is rooted in a state of unconsciousness. And this tree of human knowledge is a many branching ignorance, and our consciousness is reflected by in this tree of ignorance flowering on the ground of inconscience. And as long as we stick to this tree based on inconscience, things will always remain the same. It is only a radical change of nature and a total change of consciousness that can bring the remedy. Otherwise, we will be always moving in circles. The obscurity of inconscience throws a shadow of ignorance over all our movements in life, because basically there is an inconscience. This leads to the breadth of ignorance, and ignorance brings about division, separation, separativity from nature, from God, from others around. That is due to ignorance. And this ignorance leads to wrong knowledge and wrong will. Wrong will leads to wrong action, and wrong action produces evil, falsehood. Over all these, plentiful growth of foliage of the tree of our knowledge ignorance, mental control can only be a control and not a cure. It cannot cure. Mental standards, mental knowledge, mental solutions can help to control, but not to cure. And to cure, the first step is the separated existence of each one of us must be replaced by integration at different levels. Oneness, oneness within, oneness without. In ourselves, there is a separativity between the mind, the emotions, the life force, the body. Now that has to be integrated. Then between ourselves and others around, this separativity must go, and a growing oneness has to replace it. And this division from others and self-affirmation at the cost of others leads to wrong consciousness and wrong will. So wrong will produces wrong movements, wrong attitudes, and however much we may try to subdue these wrong impulsions of self-affirmation, of self-aggrandizement, of exploitation of others, by cultivating virtues like sympathy, like friendship, these are all very superficial movements. These superficial movements do not stand the scrutiny or the test of time. They fail when our personal interests are concerned. We speak of altruism. But Sri Aurobindo points out in a very biting sarcasm that the ego of an altruist is more difficult to conquer than the ego of an ordinary man, because the ego of an altruist has a self-righteousness about it. I am doing so much good for others, and he preens himself above others who are his beneficiaries. So he builds a wall of altruistic ego. So even altruism, unless we are very careful about the motivation of what we are doing, it also leads to a larger ego, a magnified ego. Then, if sympathy with others, work for others, all of which go under the name of altruism, also proves defective, then what about identifying oneself with the interests of others? There also Sri Aurobindo says there is a danger. If you identify yourself with others in ignorance, you suffer. That collective ego, the ego of others, expands, and your own ego may go under, but still it is under the shadow of ignorance. we have to recover our oneness in knowledge with others, not on the level of ignorance. Self-immolation, self-sacrifice is permissible only when there is a call, a higher call, say a patriotism or some human considerations, humanity, whatever it is. The self-immolation, otherwise it leads to again another kind of ego, that I am sacrificing so much. So the magnification of individual ego, magnification of collective ego, they are always to be kept in mind. And the sattvic development of virtues, development of goodness, what passes for goodness, benevolence. Now all these, we must know that they are a stage and not the goal. The sattvic perfection can only be a stage. One has to go beyond. But it is a necessary step to get over the crudities of the rajasic ego, to get over the resistances and the inertia and the immovability of the tamasic ego. So the true solution is to become one with all in knowledge, not in ignorance. And oneness with others has to arise within oneself, not by external knowledge, not by external arrangement, but within we have to develop a sense of unity, and that can only come when we take steps to realize the truth or reality of our own being, our own true selves. First we must realize. When we realize what is our soul, what is our inmost being, which is aloof, which is superior to all the movements of nature, that is what we call the soul or the psychic being. Once you touch that, once you are exposed to the influence of the psychic or the soul, things begin to radically change. You don't need to have an ethical discipline. You don't need to follow a particular ideal of the mind, but there is a self-operative machinery provided. After discovering the soul, we enthrone the soul. We give the direction of our life in the hands of the soul. We establish soul as the guide of our life. Then is the first step of self-knowledge. But that is not enough, because the realization of this soul or the psychic being is by and large a personal affair, a personal status, a personal arrival at a higher consciousness, at a deeper consciousness, a diviner consciousness, no doubt. But to realize oneness with others, it is a step but not everything. We have to go deeper and really become aware of our eternal self. Now the self is, as we have explained many times, different in a sense from the soul. The self is impersonal, eternal, infinite in comprehension, but it puts forward, it projects itself as an entity, as a personal formation in the form of the psychic entity or the soul in evolution. So after you realize the self, soul, the psychic being, you have still to go within and realize the self. Atman as they call. And that Atman is one with the Atman of all others. So there is a spontaneous and effortless realization of our unity with everybody else. We do not have to convince our mind that we are one with them, we are all brothers, like that. But there is a spontaneous evolution of oneness at the level of the self. That's not enough. The third step is not only to realize the divinity within ourselves in the form of the psychic being, the soul, to realize the eternal self in us which is one with the self of all, but also to know the divine being which is at once cosmic, universal, transcendent, going beyond the universe, and also stationed as the divine within. So the supreme, the full divinity, the full divine being in its transcendental status, Purushottama, the cosmic divine and the individual divine. All these three, they have to be realized. We are speaking of the ultimate steps, but all these do not happen step by step. Many times each takes place and helps the others to effectuate itself. But these are the three main phases, realizations, that are necessary for a radical change of nature and a total change of consciousness. And particularly when we realize this divine being in its triple aspect, there, here and here, then we see that the divine is the master of our being. The master of the sacrifice, the master of our being is the Lord, He. And we find we are only channels, channels of His puissance, channels of His Shakti. And once we come to realize this, have this knowledge, not mental knowledge, but a knowledge in consciousness, the liberation in knowledge leads to liberation of willpower from subjection to lower nature, and division from others comes to be healed by becoming conscious of our inner soul reality. At the level of the self, at the level of the soul, we find oneness. That's not enough either. So there is, at the level of nature, also this identity has to be recovered. Not only the identity between ourselves and the universal divine and the transcendental divine, at the level of the soul, but even at the level of nature. The remoteness of our individuality in nature from the omnipresent reality in nature and above nature. That is, there is the Shakti, there is the nature, which is the power of God. It has an individual status, my nature. It has a comprehensive status, universal status, as a universal nature. And above, that is the transcendental nature, which is the Parashakti. And this is the last division to be removed between our nature and the divine nature around, nature above, or to put it in a more philosophical language, the division between nature and supernature. Mayavada rests only on the recognition of nature, which they call Maya. They do not recognize that this nature can be transformed into its higher term called the supernature. So either nature is a binding Prakriti or it is an illusory force. That's what their standpoint. But our standpoint, following Sri Aurobindo, is nature has to unite with supernature. And even in the instrumental stage, even when we have not reached that summit of complete identification with the higher nature, still in our instrumental stage, this higher Shakti can act. But it acts and does act necessarily with certain modifications, with certain attenuations necessitated by our imperfections. Because ultimately the last imperfection is rooted in the inconscience. And it is only by the action of the supernature, the transcendent Shakti, through our imperfections, that the knots are untied, that nature gets ready to be transmuted. So we have to learn to open even in our nature, not only in the soul, but even in nature, to the action of higher nature. And that ultimately leads to a total remolding of our nature. So it is not enough to realize the divine master of our being, but we have also to realize our identity with his Shakti, the transcendent power, both in its universal aspect and in its transcendental aspect, which is above all limitations. It is only then that there can be a complete transmutation of our being, both in its soul aspect, soul status, and nature status. This completes this very long and difficult chapter, and I hope the succeeding chapters will be less difficult. We'll take it up next Thursday. So I think we'll wait for those who want to go to go before we start meditation.